Good evening. In 2014, off the coast of Miami, Florida, a disease emerged. But this wasn't a disease of humans. It was a disease of corals, the animals that build coral reefs. You may not have known that corals can get sick. Well, they do. They're animals, after all, and all animals can get sick. But corals are very special animals. They are the foundation of an entire ecosystem. They are the trees in the rainforests of the sea. Small coral polyps connect together to create coral colonies. Hundreds and thousands of coral colonies growing together over centuries are what build coral reefs. Small coral colonies and coral polyps build structures that are large enough to be seen from space with the naked eye. And the structures that they build are so valuable. They provide habitat for fisheries and income from tourism, and even shoreline protection for those of us who live near them. And they provide important things for the rest of the world too, like oxygen. But corals are animals, and they can get sick. And in 2014, off the coast of Miami, Florida, a lot of corals got sick. They had been through a lot. Abnormal temperatures for 2 summers in a row had caused back-to-back coral bleaching events. Coral bleaching is when the corals get so stressed they lose their colors. They're not dead, they're just stressed, and they can recover from this. But add on top of that smothering by sediments from one of the largest port dredging operations in America at the Port of Miami, and you have a recipe for disaster. It's still hotly debated, but somewhere in there, in that mess of warm water and smothering sediments, a super pathogen of corals was born. By 2014, I had been living in St. Thomas for 4 years, working as a research faculty at the University of the Virgin Islands. I had moved here from Miami, Florida, where I had received my Ph.D. in marine science with a focus on coral reefs. Frankly, I was happy and relieved to leave the Miami area, the big hectic city of Miami. Don't get me wrong, I made a lot of great friends there. I also learned so much with my access to so many universities and government agencies and organizations all working on coral reefs. But Miami is a big, hectic place. I was constantly meeting new people, and it was sometimes hard to make real connections. I often felt like I couldn't get a lot done because you didn't know everybody or know who to talk to. So I felt lucky to get the position in St. Thomas and move here to work on corals. The St. Thomas community reminded me of the relatively small community I grew up in upstate New York. And no, we don't have coral reefs in upstate New York. But the small community I grew up in, people took the time to get to know each other and made connections. In fact, it felt like everyone was connected to each other and everyone knew what everybody else did. Sometimes a bad thing, but there were very strong connections. So by 2014, I hadn't heard of this disease that had emerged off the coast of Miami because I was here in St. Thomas. I also hadn't heard of it because it took the scientists and managers who found it almost 2 years to convince the larger Florida coral reef community that something very different and very devastating was happening. And even after 2 years, people were still debating whether this was a serious situation, a real outbreak, whether it would just go away. But by 2016, 2 years after its emergence, the disease had spread up and down the coast of Florida. And it didn't just make corals ill, it killed them. Corals that were affected, white patches would appear on them. And this wasn't the bleaching, the white of bleaching, where the coral's stressed but can recover. This was coral death. The tissue was literally liquefying off of the coral, leaving dead, denuded skeleton behind. Huge corals that took hundreds of years to grow could die in a matter of days to weeks. And not just one type of coral was affected. Many were affected. More than 30 different species or types of corals were affected by this disease. Whole populations of corals were becoming affected by the disease and being lost. The beautiful and charismatic and rare pillar coral went locally extinct in the upper Florida Keys. 3 years after its emergence, this disease was finally given a name, a long and unwieldy name, probably born of too many cooks in the kitchen arguing over it: Stony coral tissue loss disease, or SCTLD. After 4 years, Florida was finally able to put a comprehensive disease response plan in place. 4 years. And they started throwing everything they had at it. They found money to develop treatments, including an antibiotic paste that divers would apply directly to the corals. They hired teams of divers to go out and treat these corals every day, all day, trying to save what they could. When the situation became so dire, they hired teams of divers to go in front of the disease front and chisel off the corals and send them off to zoos to save them from the disease. This is the equivalent of a disaster movie where an asteroid's coming and people send their children to space to save the human race. But by that point, the disease had started to emerge in other parts of the Caribbean, Mexico and Jamaica. I thought because we were in St. Thomas, far from Florida, and opposite to the prevailing Caribbean ocean currents, that we would be safe. I was wrong. Stony coral tissue loss disease emerged in St. Thomas in January of 2019, and I was one of the first to witness it. I got a text from the university's dive safety officer, Steve, who told me he saw something weird going on at Flat Key. Flat Key is a popular dive site. It also happens to be downstream of a port where ships from Florida sometimes release ballast water. Flat Key is also one of my favorite monitoring sites. There's so much coral there, and so many different types of coral, so many different colors: the browns, the blues, the reds, the greens. It also happens to be a site where that beautiful and charismatic pillar coral is locally abundant. I gathered up my team, and we went to go check it out. When we got in the water, the floor dropped out from under me. As a coral disease researcher, I had heard of stony coral tissue loss disease by then, and I knew what the signs were. The hundreds and thousands of patches of white that I saw on the coral reef were not signs of bleaching stress. They were signs of the tissue literally liquefying off of the corals. And the different types of corals that were affected were the ones that were highly susceptible to stony coral tissue loss disease. I was completely overwhelmed. I thought, how are we going to address this? We don't have nearly the resources that Florida has. I felt like David staring at my own personal Goliath. We don't have the hundreds of scientists and managers that Florida has. We don't have the tax dollars that Florida has. And geez, was anybody even going to believe me? It took Florida 4 years to mobilize their response to stony coral tissue loss disease. I was devastated. I came up from that dive and I called the local Coral Reef Initiative coordinator, Leslie. She's a graduate of our master's program and a friend and colleague. She knew the dive site I was talking about, and she had heard of stony coral tissue loss disease, so she knew what a serious situation it was. She then called the local government's outreach and education coordinator, Kitty. Kitty also knew the dive site. She hadn't heard so much about stony coral tissue loss disease, but she knew me, and she knew it must be a serious situation. Kitty reached out to the local dive shops and conservation organizations and asked them to keep an eye out for whether this disease might be around. We then decided to hold a meeting and invited all coral reef stakeholders in the Virgin Islands to attend, and virtually everyone showed up. What was interesting too, everybody knew each other or knew of each other. We were all connected together in this small community, relatively small community. Scientists, managers, students, conservationists, dive shops, fishermen, all showed up to the meeting. Most of them hadn't heard of stony coral tissue loss disease, but they listened, and then they asked what they could do. And what happened next was remarkable. We all started to work together and to make a plan and to listen to each other. Some of us went out to observe the disease, to track it, and to sample it. Some of us made posters and flyers and gave public talks. And most of the public, and a lot of the public, who mostly we knew, offered to help. Some of us got training in disease interventions, including that antibiotic paste application that I was talking about before. We also held fundraisers to raise money for the materials for that antibiotic paste. Strike teams of volunteer divers started going out in their spare time on weekends and on holidays to try to save the corals they love so much. Some of us even tried to start our own small coral rescue program, you know, the disaster movie one, where we started to chisel corals off the reef to try to save them. We didn't have nearly the resources of Florida, but we mounted a small, connected response. Florida has one of the best response structure plans in place. It took a lot of people, a lot of hard work, and a lot of time to put it there. And we were really lucky to be able to copy that structure for our own. But we were also lucky that we were so small and so connected that we started to work together from day one. We held weekly meetings where we would discuss our successes, but also our failures to get to that in time, our failures to get to the reef that we wanted to save, even our failures to hope. Because watching so much coral die on some of our favorite reefs, some of us lost hope every now and then. But we knew we could share those failures in these group meetings because someone might offer to help, or someone might offer just an encouraging word. Like the corals we were trying to save, we were small, overwhelmed, but connected in this fight. So we were lucky to have Florida's response plan to copy so that we could mount our own response, but we were also lucky that we were so small and so connected. What took Florida 4 years to do, we did in 4 months. The population of the Virgin Islands is a fraction of that of Florida, yet we mounted one of the best coordinated responses to this disease threat, or any threat to coral reefs, ever. It's been so good we've been asked to consult on other disease response plans for other states and territories, including Guam and Hawaii, and even other nations have asked us how we do it. Now, the losses from stony coral tissue loss disease have been enormous, especially at the sites we haven't been able to get to treat. And it's spread throughout the Virgin Islands. And it continues to affect corals every day. But we got out in front of it early, from day one, and that saved corals. You'll still see today teams of treatment divers going out to try to save individual corals. Now we have even full-time teams. All of this work has provided a framework to address the next coral reef pandemic, because it's coming. Climate change, overfishing, reckless development, all work to reduce the resilience of coral reefs. But the real danger is our lack of connections. Connections to the natural environment, but more importantly, connections to each other. A lack of connections to each other is what slows and confuses our response to these pandemics. 3 years later, we still meet. Not necessarily weekly, but we do still meet. We still share our successes and our failures. We're still connected. We now have a name, the Virgin Islands Coral Disease Advisory Committee. And much like the small corals that we work to save, we are overwhelmed, small, but connected. If we lose or compromise or ignore those connections, there will be no hope for coral reefs. But together, we are hopeful, and we're ready. Thank you.